It was a cold night when I decided to take a long drive down the old highway. I had just finished work late, and the roads were almost empty. The only thing I could see were the dim headlights of my car and the dark, endless stretches of trees lining the road. I turned on the radio to fill the silence, but the station was static. I tried switching channels, but each one was just noise. I felt a chill run down my spine. I reached over to turn the volume off, but something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but the longer I stared, the more I noticed the shape behind me. A figure, standing by the side of the road, wearing a long, dark coat. It seemed too still, too perfect, like it didn't belong there at all. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired. Maybe it was a trick of the light or my imagination playing games. But when I looked back in the mirror, I saw it again, closer this time. My heart started racing. I told myself to keep calm and tried to speed up, but the road seemed to stretch longer with every passing second. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen a car, and the darkness felt more suffocating than ever. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. No signal, no way to call for help. The figure was still there, now following behind me. Every time I glanced in the mirror, it was closer. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears. What should I do? What was happening? Suddenly my headlights flickered, and I lost all power. The car rolled to a stop. The silence felt unbearable. I was alone, stranded, in the middle of nowhere with no one to help me. I tried to restart the car, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was standing right behind me now. I didn't dare look out the window, but I could feel its presence, as if it was watching me, waiting. Then I heard a knock on the window. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly turned my head to the side. There, standing just inches from my face, was the figure. Its eyes were dark, empty voids that seemed to suck in all light. The longer I stared, the harder it was to breathe. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing in front of me. Slowly it raised a hand, tapping on the window again. I knew I had to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My mind screamed for me to act, but I was trapped. With a sudden jolt, the car's lights came back on, and the engine roared to life. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, speeding away from the figure. But when I looked in the rearview mirror again, it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, and even then, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I never saw that figure again. But sometimes, when I drive late at night, I swear I feel something watching me from the darkness. Years have passed since that night, but I can still feel the weight of it pressing on me. Every time I drive alone in the dark, I check my mirrors more often than I should, half expecting to see that figure standing there, waiting. But it's not just the fear of the unknown that haunts me. It's the feeling that something changed that night, something inside me. I've never been the same since. I can't explain it, but I feel different, like I've crossed some line that can never be undone. Last week I was driving down that same highway, trying to push past the memories. The road was quiet, just as it was all those years ago. I couldn't help myself. I looked in the rearview mirror again. This time, I didn't see anything, but as I kept driving, a cold wind blew through the car, even though the windows were rolled up. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and then faintly from the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned my head quickly, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The road stretched out in front of me, empty, just like before. I let out a shaky breath and drove faster, praying that I could outrun whatever it was that still haunted me. But deep down, I knew. The figure wasn't just following me on the road, it had followed me into my life. And no matter how far I drove, no matter how fast I ran, it would always be there, waiting for the right moment to catch up. Like it was made for strange things to happen. The moon was barely visible behind dark clouds, and the world seemed to hold its breath. I had just finished a late shift at work, and my car was the only thing standing between me and home. The roads were empty, the streets deserted. I could see the faint glow of the streetlights casting eerie shadows on the asphalt. I've driven this route 100 times before, But tonight something felt off. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was the fact that the radio had been giving me nothing but static for the past 10 minutes. I kept fiddling with the dial, trying to get a signal, but nothing would come through. The stillness in the air made me feel like I was the last person alive in the world. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was 2:37 a.m. I sighed, wishing I could just get home and forget the day had ever happened. As I turned onto the main road leading out of town, I felt a strange sensation, a prickling at the back of my neck. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but it didn't seem to stretch as far as it usually did. There was something about the darkness that seemed deeper, more suffocating. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I noticed something in my rearview mirror, a car. It was a faint shadow, just barely visible in the reflection. I didn't remember seeing it before, and the road was so empty that it seemed odd for another vehicle to appear out of nowhere. I checked my side mirror, but there was nothing there. It was just the car behind me, its headlights faintly glowing in the distance. I glanced at the time again, 2:42 a.m. That couldn't be right. There's no way I could have been driving for more than 5 minutes. Suddenly, the hair on my arm stood up. I could feel the presence of that car behind me, following, as if it was just waiting for the right moment to get closer. I wanted to look again, but I didn't dare. The road stretched out ahead, and there was no way to turn around. I couldn't even pull over. There was nothing but trees and empty fields for miles. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I pushed the gas pedal down, willing myself to get home faster. The faster I drove, the more I could feel the eyes of the car behind me on my back. I glanced up again, but the shadow was still there, moving at the same pace. There were no other cars on the road, no signs of life anywhere, just me, the road, and that one shadowy car that kept following. My hands were starting to sweat, and my breath came in shallow bursts. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as the car's headlights grew closer. My headlights shone bright against the dark road, but the car behind me never seemed to fall back. It stayed with me, never getting any closer, but never letting me forget it was there. I turned onto a more secluded stretch of road. There were no streetlights here, just the dense trees on either side, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the dark. This was the part of the drive that always creeped me out, but tonight it was different. The trees seemed to press closer to the road, as though they were trying to block me in. The other car was still behind me, its headlights never wavering. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just another night driver, like me, heading out to some unknown destination. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong. Something wasn't right about the way it was following me. I knew I needed to get away from it, but there was no place to hide. I took a sharp turn, my tires screeching against the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and that's when I saw it. The car was much closer now, its headlights shining bright and cold like a pair of eyes staring straight into mine. It wasn't just a car anymore, it was something else, something alive. I could see the silhouette of a figure inside the car, but it wasn't a normal person. Its outline was distorted, twisted, like it was somehow merging with the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed at me to speed up, but my legs were frozen, my foot stuck on the brake. Suddenly the figure moved. The figure in the car moved slowly, almost unnaturally so. Its head tilted to the side, and for a split second, I could see its face, or what I thought was its face. It was pale, almost white, with hollow eyes that seemed to reflect the faint light of the headlights. There was no expression on it, nothing that resembled a human emotion. It was just there. My heart raced. I pressed the accelerator harder, but the car behind me seemed to be moving at the same speed, staying right on my tail, as if it had no intention of letting me go. The trees on either side of the road blurred as I sped past them, the air outside growing colder and heavier. I felt the weight of the darkness pressing in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. And I took another sharp turn, hoping to lose the car. But when I looked in the mirror again, it was still there, closer now than before. The headlights seemed to pierce the darkness like knives. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and frantic, and yet the sound of the other car's engine was eerily silent, like it was a shadow following me, not a real vehicle at all. Come on, I muttered to myself, willing the car to go faster, to get away. But my hands were trembling, and the more I tried to push forward, the more the car behind me seemed to get closer. I turned onto another stretch of road, but this time, something was different. The streetlights that had been faint in the distance were gone. The road was pitch black now, no light except for my headlights and the shadow of the car that stalked me. I looked ahead. There was no end to the road, just more trees, more darkness. And then, as I glanced at the rearview mirror once again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure in the car was no longer sitting still. It was moving, slowly, deliberately, its long, thin fingers stretched out toward the dashboard, pressing against the glass of the window, as though it was trying to I gasped, my hands shaking harder on the wheel. I slammed my foot down on the gas, desperate to put distance between us, but the car behind me was keeping pace, refusing to let me escape. I could feel it, its presence, right there in the darkness, closing in. I looked up ahead and saw a figure in the distance. A person, standing in the middle of the road. I froze, my eyes widening. Who was that? Why were they out here, alone at this hour? It didn't make sense. I couldn't stop in time, not with the way I was speeding, and there was no way to swerve to avoid them. My heart pounded as I slammed my foot down on the brake. The car lurched forward, but the figure didn't move. It was like they were waiting for me, standing still in the middle of the road, their silhouette dark against the night. The closer I got, the more I could see. Their face was twisted, distorted, like the figure in the car. And then, just as I was about to hit them, they vanished. Gone. Just like that. I skidded to a stop, my car screeching against the road. I didn't know what was happening anymore. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely hold the steering wheel. I looked around, but there was nothing. No figure. No person in the road. Nothing. But the car was still behind me. The headlights were no longer distant. They were right there, so close I could almost feel the heat from them. I wasn't alone. I wasn't safe. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. The static was replaced with a voice, low, distorted, like it was coming from far away. Run! That word echoed in my ears, sending a chill down my spine. I didn't need to be told twice. I floored the accelerator again, speeding down the empty road, my heart in my throat. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. I turned another corner, praying I could lose it, but the headlights of the car were still there, following me, never wavering. I was trapped. Nowhere to hide. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the road ahead opened up into a small clearing. A small, old gas station sat in the distance, its flickering light barely visible through the darkness. I didn't think. I just drove toward it, hoping for a place to stop, a place to escape. As I pulled into the parking lot, I slammed on the brakes, but something was wrong. The car behind me didn't stop. It kept coming. The headlights grew brighter, and then, just as the car was about to reach me, it vanished. Everything went silent. I sat there, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. I looked around, but there was no sign of the car, no trace of anything unusual. The gas station was empty, the lights dim and flickering as though they were about to go out. I didn't know what was real anymore. But one thing was clear, I wasn't alone. I sat there, in the stillness of the empty parking lot, staring at the dark road ahead. My hands were slick with sweat, my mind racing. The car was gone, the figure was gone. But the terror, the feeling of being watched, lingered in the air like a thick fog. I tried to catch my breath, to make sense of what had just happened. My eyes darted around the parking lot, the shadows stretching across the cracked pavement. The gas station was a relic, a forgotten place that didn't belong here. The faint glow from the lights above flickered, casting an eerie pulse of light that made everything feel unreal. "Get out of the car," I whispered to myself, willing my body to move. I couldn't stay here, not in this place, not with whatever it was still out there. But my body didn't respond. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to make sense of the nightmare I had just experienced. It was then that I noticed something strange. The gas station, though old and decrepit, should have been empty. But in the faint light of the flickering bulbs, I saw something moving, a figure. It was standing near the back of the building, half hidden by shadows. I couldn't make out who or what it was, but it was there, watching. I blinked hard, my heart pounding. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, like it was waiting for me to make a decision, to get out of the car, and then the voice came again. It wasn't from the radio this time, it was from somewhere deeper, from within the very fabric of the night itself. "Leave, before it comes back." I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed the car into reverse, spinning the wheel to pull out of the parking lot. My tires screeched against the pavement as I sped away, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't dare look back. The night stretched out in front of me, endless and dark. I could still feel the presence behind me, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stay in that place any longer. I drove and drove, passing through empty towns, endless stretches of road that seemed to never end. The world outside was silent, still. The car behind me, the one that had followed me all this time, was gone. The figure was gone. But the fear, the feeling of something lurking just out of sight, didn't leave. I eventually made it home, though I wasn't sure how. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a long time, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. I stared at the dark house in front of me, the windows dark, the door closed. Everything was quiet, too quiet. I couldn't tell anyone about what happened. No one would believe me. I didn't even believe it myself. I didn't know if it was some kind of nightmare, some trick of my mind, or something far worse that I couldn't understand. But as I stepped out of the car and into the cold night air, I heard something. A distant sound, barely audible. It was a car engine, faint but unmistakable, and it was getting closer. Autumn evening, and the moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting eerie shadows on the deserted highway. I had been driving for hours, the hum of the engine and the faint crackle of the radio keeping me company. The road stretched endlessly ahead, bordered by thick forests that seemed to close in as the night deepened. I was on my way back home after visiting a friend in a nearby city. The drive was supposed to take 3 hours, but I had left later than planned. By the time I hit the road, it was already well past midnight. The highway was eerily quiet, with no cars in sight for miles. I didn't mind, though. I enjoyed the solitude of night drives, at least I used to. About an hour into the drive, my fuel gauge started dipping dangerously close to empty. I cursed under my breath. I had been so focused on leaving that I forgot to fill up. The next gas station was at least 20 miles away, according to the last sign I had passed. I decided to conserve fuel by slowing down and turning off the air conditioning. The darkness seemed to grow heavier, wrapping around the car like a suffocating blanket. The only light came from my headlights, which barely pierced the inky blackness. The trees on either side of the road looked like twisted silhouettes, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, a tall man dressed in a long coat, his face obscured by the shadows. He stood completely still, facing the road, as though he was waiting for someone. A chill ran down my spine as I drove past him. Something about him felt off. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him fade into the distance, but he was gone. The road behind me was empty. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. Maybe I was imagining things after hours of driving alone. But as I continued, the air inside the car grew colder, and an inexplicable sense of dread settled over me. The radio crackled, breaking the silence. Static filled the car, and I reached over to adjust the dial. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper buried beneath the static. "Turn back." my hand hovering over the radio. The whisper was faint but unmistakable. I quickly turned the radio off, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the headlights flickered. For a brief moment, I was plunged into total darkness. I slammed the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the empty road. The headlights came back on, but the beam seemed weaker, as if struggling to cut through the darkness. That's when I saw him again. The same man, standing in the middle of the road, just a few feet ahead of my car. This time I got a better look at him. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. He stared directly at me, unblinking. My breath caught in my throat as I slammed the car into reverse. The tires screeched as I backed away, my hands shaking on the wheel. The man didn't move. He just stood there watching me. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I shifted back into drive, swerving around him and speeding down the road. My heart was racing, and I couldn't stop glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see him following me. For a while, the road was empty again. I began to think I had escaped whatever that was, but then the car started to sputter. The fuel gauge was now on empty. No, 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 I muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. I scanned the darkness for any sign of a gas station, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of highway and the oppressive forest. The car eventually slowed to a stop, the engine dying with a final, pitiful groan. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no idea how far I was from help. I sat in the car for a while, trying to calm my nerves. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, but they grew louder, echoing in the still night. My blood ran cold as I realized they were coming from the woods, slowly but steadily approaching the car. I locked the doors and turned off the lights, hoping to make the car look empty. My hands were trembling, and I could barely breathe as I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped just outside the driver's side door. I didn't dare look. I kept my eyes fixed on the dashboard, my heart hammering in my chest. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I couldn't bring myself to look, couldn't face whatever was outside. The knock came again, louder this time. "Let me in," a voice whispered, muffled through the glass. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The voice came again, more insistent. "Let me in." I finally mustered the courage to look. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. But there was nothing there. The window was fogged up, but I could see clearly that no one was outside. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. When I turned back to face the front, my blood turned to ice. He was sitting in the passenger seat, the man from the road, his hollow eyes staring straight ahead. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just sat there, his presence suffocating. I scrambled to unlock the door, my hands fumbling in my panic. But before I could escape, he turned to look at me. His lips parted, and he whispered two words that I will never forget. Too late. The world went dark. The next thing I remember, I woke up in my car, parked on the side of the road. The sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the landscape. My car started without any trouble, and the fuel gauge was mysteriously full. I never spoke about that night to anyone. But every time I drive down that highway, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, waiting. Even after I returned home, the events of that night haunted me. I tried to push it out of my mind, convincing myself that it was all a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew better. The experience left a mark, one that wouldn't fade no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. A few weeks later, I found myself on the same highway again. It wasn't by choice. I had a work meeting in the same city, and this was the fastest route. As I merged onto the road, my chest tightened. The trees looked just as menacing as before, their gnarled branches looming like silent sentinels. It was still daylight, but the unease grew with every mile. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing on the side of the road. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. About halfway to my destination, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A car was parked on the shoulder, its hood propped open as if it had broken down. A man stood next to it, waving at passing cars for help. It was him, the same man from that night. The gaunt face, the hollow eyes, the long coat. It was all the same. He stood there, his arm raised in a desperate gesture, but his expression was calm, almost expectant. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, but something compelled me to slow down. It was as if an invisible force was pulling me toward him. As I got closer, his head turned to look at me. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and my heart felt like it stopped. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then, in an instant, he was gone. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I came to a halt. My chest heaved as I scanned the road and the shoulder, but there was nothing there. No car, no man, nothing. The stretch of highway was empty, the silence deafening. I sat there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was I losing my mind? And a fool trick my brain was playing on me? When I finally started driving again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just missed something important, some kind of warning or message. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but the tension in my chest didn't ease until I reached my destination. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Those hollow eyes stared back at me, filled with something I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't malice, it was almost sadness. Desperate for answers, I started researching the history of the highway. I spent hours combing through old news articles and local legends, hoping to find something that could explain what I had seen. What I discovered sent chills down my spine. 20 years ago, there had been a series of mysterious disappearances along that stretch of road. Drivers would vanish without a trace, their cars found abandoned days later. The authorities had no leads, and the cases were eventually closed, chalked up to accidents or people running. But locals whispered about a ghostly figure, a man who appeared on the side of the road, luring unsuspecting drivers to their doom. The descriptions matched him perfectly. I found a grainy photograph in one of the articles. It was a group photo from the 1970s, taken at a roadside diner that had long since closed down. My heart nearly stopped when I spotted him in the back row, staring directly at the camera. Even in the black and white image, his eyes seemed to pierce through the page. According to the article, the man in the photo was a drifter who had been hit by a car late one night while hitchhiking. His body was never claimed, and he was buried in an unmarked grave near the highway. Some believed his spirit still roamed the road, seeking revenge, or perhaps trying to warn others of the same fate. I didn't know what to believe, but one thing was certain. I wasn't imagining him. He was real, or at least he had been. After that, I avoided the highway as much as possible, but sometimes life has other plans. A few months later, I had no choice but to take that route again. This time, I was prepared, or so I thought. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look at the trees or the shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. About an hour into the drive, the air grew heavy, and the temperature inside the car dropped. I knew what was coming before I even saw him. He was there, standing in the middle of the road, his pale face illuminated by my headlights. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were others. Dozens of figures emerged from the forest, their forms faint and translucent. They surrounded the car, their faces blank and expressionless. My heart pounded as I locked the doors and gripped the wheel, unsure of what to do. Then, the man stepped forward, his eyes locking onto mine. He raised a hand, pointing at something in the distance. I followed his gaze and saw a bright light in the forest, a flickering golden glow that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Before I could react, the figures vanished, leaving me alone on the road. The light in the forest faded, and the oppressive darkness returned. I don't drive at night anymore. Whatever I saw on that highway, it wasn't meant for this world. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers in the static of the radio calling me back to the road, and I know that one day, I might not be able to resist. Years passed, but the memories of that highway never faded. I avoided the area entirely, no matter how inconvenient it was. The haunting presence of the man, the whispers, the figures, they stayed with me like shadows in the back of my mind. But as time went on, I started to convince myself it was over. Whatever had happened that night, it was done. Or so I thought. One night, I found myself dreaming about the highway. In the dream, I was driving the same stretch of road, but this time the forest was alive with golden lights. The man was there again, standing in the center of the road. He didn't look menacing this time, he looked tired. His hollow eyes met mine, and for the first time he spoke clearly. "You need to finish this." I woke up in a cold sweat, his words echoing in my mind. No matter how much I tried to dismiss it as just a dream, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a message. Something was calling me back to that highway, something unfinished. Against every instinct in my body, I decided to return. I set out before sunset, determined to face whatever was waiting for me. As I approached the stretch of road where everything had begun, the air grew heavy, just like before. The trees seemed to press closer, and the darkness fell faster than it should have. It didn't take long before I saw him. The man stood by the side of the road, just as I remembered. But this time, he raised his hand and pointed to the woods. My heart pounded as I pulled over, the engine idling. I knew what he wanted me to do. He wanted me to follow. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at my skin. The man disappeared into the trees, and I hesitated for only a moment before following him. The forest was unnaturally silent, the only sound coming from the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. The golden light I had seen before flickered in the distance, guiding me deeper into the woods. Finally, I reached a clearing. In the center was an old rusted car, its frame twisted and covered in moss. The golden light emanated from within the car, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding trees. As I stepped closer, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A gravestone, partially buried in the earth. The name on it was weathered and unreadable, but I knew who it belonged to. The man appeared beside the car, his form faint and flickering. He pointed to the gravestone, then to me, as if asking for my help. I realized then what he wanted. He wasn't seeking revenge. He wasn't trying to haunt me. He wanted to be found, to be remembered. I knelt by the gravestone and began clearing away the dirt and leaves. As I worked, the air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight lifted. The man stood silently, watching me. When I was finished, the golden light enveloped the clearing, brighter than ever before. The man stepped forward, his form growing more solid. For the first time, I saw a faint smile on his face. He nodded at me, a gesture of gratitude, before slowly fading into the light. And then, he was gone. When I returned to my car, the forest felt different, peaceful, almost welcoming. I drove home that night without incident, the darkness no longer suffocating. I knew deep down that it was finally over. The highway still exists, of course, and people still tell stories about strange happenings on that stretch of road. But for me, the chapter has closed. Whatever haunted that road has found peace, and now so have I.